Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Future Hacker. I'm your host, Maria Taide. As you know, I've been asking my guests about all this bias that is still being fed into artificial intelligence, as it reflects the past and current state of our society, right? So, I met someone that is working on solving this gap, and when it comes to hiring and managing talent. And guess what? She's our guest today. So today we're talking to Kathleen Wu. She's the founder and CEO of Rumarocket, a talent management platform that uses machine algorithms to help companies find the right people for their hiring needs. They combine behavior science and artificial intelligence modeling for HR. It's about bringing the people component into the technology, which is something hard to see, especially when it comes to software development, right? So, hi, Kath. It's so good to see and to have you with us today. How are you doing?
Hey, Maria. Glad to be here today. It's a bit late here, but still very much excited to be part of this.
Thank you so much. We're super excited to have you, Kath. So let's do this. You know, you have a really impressive story. You already worked at the United Nations to help them predict earthquake disasters. You ended up founding your own tech startup, which you had to pivot a number of times and went through a real roller coaster, right? Until getting where you are today. So before we get into this whole tech piece, can you please share your story with our listeners?
Oh, I'd be glad to. I actually started my company as a college student, and it started out as my thesis project. One of the challenges I was encountering was I had a lot of good friends who were applying for part-time jobs, but because they didn't have a college degree at that time, they were having challenges getting accepted into call center roles. So one of the things I was interested early on was the recruitment process and how I could understand it from a standpoint of how people make decisions and what are the challenges at each decision point. And of course, how to eliminate the bias that comes with the recruitment decision. So what I did was I wrote it into a paper and I submitted it to my professor. And she took one look at it and she told me that this was not something that made sense. And she asked me to rewrite my thesis. But because I was really passionate about it, I decided to email a professor at MIT instead and a graduate student of machine learning in Stanford to better understand how I could turn this project into something more. And that really was the beginnings of what eventually became my company, Rumarocket. So what we're concerned with is really looking at the behavioral science aspect and the machine learning aspect and combining them together to understand and to map and to build solutions around how people make decisions, not only in the workplace, but also for recruitment, talent management, retention, and so on. It's something that I've been passionate about for a long time. But as we've seen since the pandemic, things have become a bit more challenging in that space. Now, more than ever, a lot of the organizations we've worked with are having to go digital just to survive. And I'm seeing more and more workforces are challenged with adapting to this new normal that we're all experiencing. And it's really validated a lot of the things that I first started in 2012.
You know, one of the many things that I love about your story is that you're such a great example for all entrepreneurs, you know, because we are all going to hear a lot of no's in our life, people saying we have those crazy ideas and want to work out. But, you know, you followed your passion and you followed your gut instinct for sure. And, you know, you just didn't stop there when they told you to stop. You just went ahead and you had so many challenges to face and you could overcome them and pivot so many times. Congratulations, really, Kath.
Thank you so much. I think for me, most of the failures that I've experienced, and I was lucky to experience many as a young person, have really been world-changing, mind-changing life experiences for me. So I guess I was lucky in the sense that my mom, when I was young, taught me early on how to fail and how to do it in such a way that I could pick myself up and get up and keep running. So one of the things that I experienced as an entrepreneur was challenges with clients, of course, challenges with funding. But in spite of it all, there was always an opportunity to reinvent myself in terms of what I was doing. So initially, when Rumarocket first started, we did a lot of recruitment-based analytics and AI. And as we sort of grew, we made a lot of mistakes in the process, specifically with how we trained algorithms to make recruitment decisions. And it led to a few challenges on the client side. So there was a period of time when a lot of our clients were having challenges with the tool. And presented with that, we went back to the drawing board, changed a few of the variables that we were using, and then went back and implemented it again. And eventually we realized that the talent management cycle didn't stop at recruitment. More often than not, you hired the right person, but the right person didn't tend to stay in the company because they had challenges with either the pay, the benefits, or the experience of working 24/7 with something they weren't really passionate about. And what we realized was that recruitment was only part of the problem. And if we could look at and map out the entire talent management cycle with data, we could actually tell a story of how employees came into the company passionate, engaged, curious about what to do, and lost their enthusiasm over time. And what we saw was a lot of the time, the managers that companies were promoting were not necessarily the best at managing people. And so many companies were losing millions every year just because of that fact. We're used to thinking about people science as a soft skill. It's HR, it's administrative. But now, more than ever, there really needs to be a push towards thinking about talent strategically, in the sense that we think about finance strategically, for example. And for me and for what we're doing at Rumarocket, it's really exciting to be on the forefront of that revolution.
Yeah, definitely. So, Kath, you told me that the way machine learning is taught is not efficient and consuming power of the computers, right? So why is that?
Oh, so the interesting thing about how we train machine learning right now is if you got an equivalent human, let's say a baby, and you train them with the methods that we're mostly implementing in machine learning right now, you would basically be sticking the child's finger to a hot stove as many times as possible just so they're able to learn that touching a hot stove might not necessarily be a good idea. So what I mean by that is machine learning right now is very data dependent. You need a lot of data to be able to train certain algorithms. And at the same time, you also need to be able to implement a very large algorithm to train for different use cases. So a lot of the time you have companies like Google, IBM, Microsoft in some ways where they're using a lot of processing power and energy to train an algorithm to do something very specific and to train it using a lot of data. And the challenge right now is a lot of the data is context dependent. So one of the examples that I like to share is during the application process, when we run an assessment, the average scores of a job applicant are usually very, very high. So for example, for a factor like grit, when the applicant applies for a job, they're usually in the top 5% of grit scores that we've taken. But what we've found is once they get hired, 6 months to 1 year into the position, the grit score starts moving closer to the average. So when you look at it, the context of being an applicant for a job actually affects the data point that's collected, specifically grit at that point in time. And when you look at it from a standpoint of training machine learning algorithms to get smarter, you can multiply that one case by millions and millions of data points, and you start to see that the way we're training machine learning algorithms is rather inefficient. It's very specific and context-based, but there are opportunities to improve how we do it right now. Specifically, we can look at neuroscience, how people are able to learn from experience. So the interesting thing biologically about people as a species is we're one of the few types of animals who are able to learn from watching others make mistakes or from watching others go through an experience in front of us. And those methods applied to machine learning can actually supercharge a lot of the processes that are so data heavy, processing power heavy today. And for me, that's a really exciting part of it, combining the people with the technology aspect to push things forward in a fundamental way.
That's super interesting, Kath. You know, in almost our podcast, we end up discussing how people should be preparing for jobs of the future, and also how companies should be preparing to get all the hiring process and incentives right for this next generation. It seems to me that AI and machine learning can play a key role in helping HR and leaders moving this path. But, how to correctly make use of those technologies in order to achieve the best results?
I think a good way to approach this question would be to look at the case where it was applied correctly and a case where it wasn't applied correctly. So let me share a few case studies we've worked with for some of the companies we've had the opportunity to collaborate with. So one of the companies we worked with is this up-and-coming real estate firm in the Philippines. And when we first started working with them, only about 3% of their sales force was making sales. The other 97% were basically being hired, collecting an allowance for 3 months, and then moving on without closing a single sale for the company. And one of the things that we did early on was we dove down into the data of what makes the top 3% of these salespeople so excellent at their jobs. And an interesting thing we found was these people were less likely to be college graduates. They were more likely to have experienced significant adversity in their life. And as a result, their grit and their resilience tended to be on a higher scale. So when dealing with adversity, most of them tended to phrase their challenges in terms of, I surmounted or I experienced this, as opposed to this happened to me. Essentially, most of them took a very active role in how they surmounted adversity. And it correlated quite well with a very high grit score. So once we applied that process into their recruitment system, within 6 months, I think 96% of their sales force was making sales. Within a year, every salesperson hired through the AI was making twice the amount of sales as every previous hire before. And they were making sales in the first month as opposed to the third month. And the interesting thing about this was a lot of the selections made by the algorithm actually found that people with high education or more privileged indicators in their CVs during the recruitment process tended to be less adept at the act of just closing sales. So in this case, the algorithm found that when you controlled for inequities and different backgrounds, and you just looked at the raw ability of being able to close a sale, you actually were able to ensure that a bigger part of the population being recruited got more of the opportunities. And this translated to a very high, I think It's about a 56 times increase in sales for that company that we work with. So in the correct case, the advantage was they analyzed the data carefully. They knew what they were measuring for, and they were conscious about the inequities and the equality of their decision-making process. They really made the deliberate effort to make their decision-making process as transparent as possible around recruiting sales. And not only did it translate to high sales for them, it also meant that the company was able to find talent who would not normally be selected in a recruitment process. So that's an example of a good company or a good AI implementation. Let's go to not so good implementation. So this company we worked with actually was looking at ways to motivate their salespeople because they were afraid that most of them were about to leave. And one of the patterns we found was that whenever the salesperson's quota topped up at 100% or more than 100%, it increased the probability that they would leave quite significantly within the next 6 months. So what happened for that company was they would set a sales quota and the salespeople would try to meet it. And each salesperson would get an incentive based on how much of the quota that they met. So at that period, what we found was they were just coming off a good year when they had to replace, I think, 80% of their sales team due to attrition. And when we looked at the data, we found that most of their salespeople were topping up at 112% of quota, 106%, and they were improving at a smaller rate. So what we did was we warned the managers that this was likely to happen. But based on the management decision at that point, they decided to take away the Christmas incentive, from what I remember, because they felt like the salespeople were getting way too much incentives as they met the quota. So we recommended against it, but the management at that time wanted to cut costs to manage things a bit more efficiently. And what happened was within 6 months, most of their high performers had left the company. So why I say it's an example of data analytics and AI done wrong is most of the time, the analytics won't exactly give you the picture that you're looking for. So a lot of the managers have really strong theories about how things should be, or their theories about how their people or how their talent works out well together. And when the data doesn't support their theories, most managers would rather stick to their theories instead of work with the data, because there's already a commitment to the theory. But what the data presents is really an alternative perspective of looking at things. And once you have that information with you and are able to make decisions around it, it empowers you significantly to move forward and to grow or make decisions on a business level. So a lot of the time, when you think about good or poor AI implementations, it comes down to the people and how they make decisions with information. And that's why for me, it's really critical that companies not only get their technology right, but also their people right.
Great case study examples, Kath. And it's exactly what you said. It's not just about getting your company prepared to be investing in technology, but especially you have to be investing in preparing the employees and the leaders to be using it correctly and to open their minds to whichever information they're going to get back from it, so they are actually able to make wiser business decisions, right? So everybody, you can see that we have a lot of rich information. We still have a lot to talk about. So this is the end of the first episode with Kathleen Wu, but stay tuned. We're coming back with the episode number 2.
Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.